The lost NES version of SimCity has finally been shared with the world 27 years after it was announced, but never released. What's up, everybody? I'm Josh Meek, the Uber Geek, and welcome to Pretty Dece, your daily entertainment and pop culture show. And in 1991, it was announced that Nintendo and Will Wright of Maxis Games were collaborating to bring the PC game SimCity to both the NES and the SNES, so both the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super Nintendo. And this was a pretty big deal because SimCity was this PC game, this kind of quintessential PC game, and they were bringing it to the console where a game like that had really never been in effect. No one had seen a game like that on consoles. Now, the SNES version launched alongside the hardware for the SNES, and truly it's a fantastic game. It mapped a lot of the complicated SimCity concepts onto the less powerful home console as opposed to the PC. And it did so while adding some really cool Nintendo flair and style that wasn't present in the PC version of the game. And a lot of the features that they added for the NES and for the SNES version rather, they brought forward into later versions of SimCity. So it wasn't just a less featured port that showed up on the consoles, it was a moving forward of the genre, in fact. And again, really, it's a great game and still holds up today. Now, the NES version was supposed to launch alongside of the SNES version. It was announced alongside the SNES version, and it was supposed to have all the same features. Basically the same exact gameplay, just the SNES version was going to have slightly better graphics because of the more powerful hardware. Unfortunately, this NES version of the game never actually came out. Nintendo killed the game, maybe because they wanted to push people towards the new system and get people to buy the new game on the new hardware, but no one really knows why. The game was just never completed and never actually came out. Up until very recently. Up until recently, we only had screenshots, a few kind of first-hand accounts and video of the game being played at trade shows, but now the Video Game History Foundation has acquired prototype copies of the game, and they've published a very lengthy blog post kind of detailing the differences of the game between the NES and the SNES versions and all of the promotional material surrounding it and the history of how they obtained the cartridges and what they found in the source code even of the game. Very in-depth, lots of crazy research and material that went into this write-up on this game. So a brief history of the game. The prototype cartridges that they eventually analyzed showed up at a used game store in Seattle last year. The owner of them brought them in to sell them. Eventually these got sold off to collectors, and one of those cartridges found its way to the Video Game History Foundation. Since then, they've been able to dump the contents of both of those prototypes and found out that they're identical, so they're the exact same builds of the game. And they went through this extensive research and kind of note-taking process. They broke down the games, and essentially they are the same. The NES version and the SNES version of the games are the same games. They have a lot of the same menu layouts and structures. The gameplay is the same. There are just some minor differences, and of course the graphical differences that would naturally come between an NES game and a Super Nintendo game. A couple of the minor differences: the tile sets are larger on the NES, meaning your city layouts have to lay out slightly differently because the tiles are larger. But again, for the most part, they are shockingly similar games, which means that this game is one of the most complicated, kind of feature-rich games the NES would have seen. The game is unfortunately unfinished, though. There are typos and errors throughout it. There's even parts where the game logic is just broken. So clearly things they were going to finish as they kind of closed out the game and mopped up some of these issues. But the Video Game History Foundation has determined that, according to a source, they have an inside source, the game was never finished. So this is probably the most complete build of the game that exists. The work wasn't done to fix these issues that we see in this ROM of the game right now. So it is what it is. We can mostly play the game and see what it's like and compare these differences, but it certainly isn't in a polished, finished, releasable state. The coolest part, however, of the entire ROM dump of this game and the entire investigative process of this game is that it has a completely unique soundtrack composed by Soya Oka, who is the composer of Super Mario Kart and Pilot Wings and many other games, classic games on Nintendo hardware. She also composed the Super Nintendo version of SimCity, but the tracks, while might having the same name, are different from the NES and the SNES versions. So vastly different compositions. So, for example, here is a segment of the city theme for the Super Nintendo version. We'll hear that now. And here is a snippet of the city theme for the NES version, which in my opinion is the much more beautiful version. Here's that version now. As you can see, the versions are very, very different just in those little snippets that you heard. The NES version is kind of this like weird, like hauntingly beautiful version. Of course, much more stripped down because of the NES hardware. But there's a big breakdown in the blog post and in a video that the Video Game History Foundation put out about kind of all the work that went into kind of the weird compositional tricks that went into this soundtrack. So really cool stuff there as well. Now, I'm not even scratching the surface of the really impressive research that the Video Game History Foundation did into this game, so if you are nerdy like me and things like this fascinate you, where they break down the specific channels in the NES sound hardware and why they're using specific ones and the specific sizes of samples and things like that, definitely go check out this massive write-up, this big blog post. You can find that put out by the Video Game History Foundation. You can find that at gamehistory.org/SimCity. So definitely go check that out. But a super cool piece of video game history is finally now written up and archived for posterity. So that's going to do it for Pretty Dece for today. Thank you very much for joining me to talk about this recently found unreleased version of SimCity for the NES. If you want to support Pretty Dece, you can do so. Visit prettydeceshow.com/listener support to find out those details. Of course, you can download the podcast from your favorite podcast delivery platform or watch the show on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com/prettydece to find that channel. And of course, hit me up on social media. I love hearing from you guys. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Pretty Dece Show.